August 9, 1974, Meade County, Kansas. The first thing Raymond Holt noticed was the absence of resistance at the bottom of the line. He was 64 years old, and for 33 of those years, he had dropped a steel float on a braided cotton measuring line into the casing of his east irrigation well each spring and each fall, recording the depth to water in the leather ledger his father Cecil had started in 1929. The float always met the water surface before his arm reached its full extension. That morning in the flat gray light before sunrise, with the smell of alkali dust biting at the back of his throat the way it always did when the southwest Kansas ground ran dry and the wind came east, it didn't. He counted off the feet as the line descended. The float touched water at 11. He stood there for a moment. The cold steel ring of the casing pressed against his knuckles. He counted again. 11 feet. The normal static level in this section of the Ogallala Formation ran between 40 and 44 feet. He had 38 years of his father's measurements and his own 23 years of data to anchor that number. He checked it twice. He wrote it in the ledger in pencil, the way Cecil had always written it, not pen, because pencil could be corrected cleanly, and correction was honest. He walked to the west well, 400 yards across the field, and lowered the line again. 14 feet. Raymond had irrigated 220 of his 380 acres from these two wells since 1951. The Federal Land Bank held a note against this land for $28,200, due in full in December 1979. His winter wheat and grain sorghum stood in the August heat, alive but needing one more irrigation cycle to fill the grain. Without that cycle, at $3.40 a bushel against current yield projections, he was looking at an $8,400 shortfall against a loan he had no margin to miss. He stood with the measuring tape still coiled in both hands and looked east toward the Meridian Beef Products facility, 4 miles away against the flat horizon, its stack already trailing white vapor into the pale Kansas morning. The plant had been running since March of 1972. He knew what he was looking at. What he did not yet know was whether the right people would look at the same evidence and arrive at the same conclusion. If you've never heard this story before, subscribe. This channel covers real American history like this every week. The leather ledger had been running for 45 years. Cecil Holt had begun measuring his wells in May 1929, 2 months after the first one was drilled. He used a steel float on a braided cotton line, always at the same seasons, late April, early August, always noting precipitation, temperature, and any change in pump use in the same entry. Raymond had continued the practice from 1951 without interruption. The ledger ran to 516 entries by August 1974, every one of them written in pencil, in one of 2 hands. When Raymond spread it open on the kitchen table and ran a finger down the east well column, the story it told was simple and specific. From 1929 through the fall of 1971, the water table beneath his land declined at an average of 0.31 feet per year, the expected, documented depletion of the High Plains Ogallala, consistent with the Kansas Geological Survey's published regional figures. Some drought years pulled the level lower. Wet years allowed partial recovery. but the long-run trend was gradual, consistent, and known. In the spring of 1973, the east well dropped 5.1 feet in a single season. That fall, another 3.9. By August 1974, Raymond's east well had lost 14.3 feet in 27 months. He checked the precipitation column alongside those entries. The 1973 annual total for Meade County was 19.2 inches, 97% of the 30-year average. The year 1972 had run above average. Neither year justified a decline of that magnitude. The drought argument, if anyone made it, would not hold against these numbers. He drove to Liberal the second week of September 1974 and sat across a desk from Harold Veach, an attorney who practiced water rights and agricultural law in Seward County. He set the ledger on the desk and opened it to 1972. He did not explain what he believed had caused the change. He let the numbers speak. Veach studied the columns for several minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Do you know what Meridian is permitted to draw per day?" Raymond said he knew what they had applied for. Veach told him the rest. Meridian Beef Products, Inc. had received a water appropriation permit from the Kansas Division of Water Resources in 1971 for 185,000 gallons per day. Metering records Veach had already obtained through a contact at the division showed that Meridian's actual average daily withdrawal between June 1972 and July 1974 was 2.08 million gallons, 11 times their permitted allocation. Every day for 26 months, Raymond set his hands flat on the desk. Veach said, "I'll take this on contingency." The record you're holding is the case. The formal complaint reached the Kansas Division of Water Resources on September 19, 1974. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Meridian's legal team in Wichita. It ran 2 pages, professionally formatted. Its core argument contained in one sentence near the middle. Water level declines in Meade County during the period in question were consistent with regional drought conditions and did not constitute evidence of unlawful appropriation by Meridian Beef Products, Inc. Raymond placed the letter in the ledger beside the precipitation column. He penciled in the Meade County annual totals for 1972 and 1973 in the margin. Then he went back outside. At the grain elevator in Meade that fall, the opinion ran one direction. Raymond Holt was a good farmer, but he was taking a fight to a company that employed 200 people in the county, and he was going to lose it. The county extension agent said at a public meeting in October that Ogallala depletion was a systemic, multi-user problem, and that singling out one industrial appropriator was not a realistic legal strategy. Nobody in the room said a word to contradict him. Cecil Holt had drilled 3 wells between 1929 and 1938. The first 2 found water in the upper Ogallala at 87 and 91 feet respectively. The third, sunk in the summer of 1938 to supply a 60-acre expansion on the east end of the property, required a different search. The driller, Amos Prout of Dodge City, noted in his log that at 312 feet the bit passed through a confining clay layer and entered a pressurized zone where water rose in the casing, without pumping artesian pressure from a confined formation with no surface connection to the upper aquifer. Prout completed the well to 347 feet. Cecil's ledger entry for September 2, 1938, read, "Third well finished at 347 feet. Water under pressure rises to 289 feet in casing without the pump running." Amos says this lower water is fed separate from the upper. Different system entirely. Tastes of iron and limestone. Cold even in the August heat. Cecil had used that well for domestic water only. Its yield with the small centrifugal pump he installed was approximately 4 gallons per minute, insufficient for field irrigation. But through the dry years of the late 1930s, when the upper wells dropped measurably season by season in the ledger entries, the deep well stayed where it was. Cecil noted this without analysis, entry after entry, for 17 years. Raymond had read those entries 100 times since 1951. On the morning of August 9, 1974, before he drove to Liberal, Raymond had checked the deep well as he always did in August. The water level stood at 281 feet, precisely where it had stood in every single measurement since 1951. The Ogallala was being systematically emptied 4 miles to the east. The confined lower formation had not moved a foot in 23 years. Raymond did not mention the deep well in his complaint to the division. He did not tell Veach about it. He drove back from Liberal in early September and walked the east quarter of the property for 2 hours in the long afternoon light, the soil fine and dry against the soles of his boots, reading the topography the way his father had taught him to read it, watching the subtle depressions marking buried drainage channels, the faint ridges where limestone approached the surface. What he understood, and what no one at the Extension Office or State Geological Survey had ever catalogued, because no one had thought to request Amos Prout's 1938 drill log, was that the confined aquifer beneath his land was not an oddity or a domestic convenience. It was a separate water source with a separate recharge mechanism, connected, as Prout had noted in his records, by a fault formation running northeast toward the Cimarron Breaks, fed by a completely different infiltration zone. It had survived everything the Ogallala above it had endured for 4 decades. The problem was lifting that water at a useful volume. 4 gallons per minute from a domestic pump was not irrigation capacity. Moving water at field irrigation scale from 347 feet required a substantial pump, and running a substantial electric pump at that depth with 1974 diesel costs, or with an REA electric line that stopped at his property boundary, would cost more per gallon than his crops could justify, unless the electricity was free. He had read 4 paragraphs in a Farm Journal article that August about a demonstration project in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, where a university team had powered a 4-inch submersible pump from a photovoltaic solar array. The panels were expensive. The system was small. But the article noted that panel costs had fallen 40% since 1972 and were projected to continue falling as commercial production scaled up. Raymond clipped that article. He placed it in the ledger beside his father's 1938 well entry. He needed a specific number from the legal case before any of the rest of it could move. He needed 2 more years of patience. He had both. The legal process moved through the fall and winter of 1974 with the unhurried pace of a groundwater formation. Harold Veach filed supporting documentation with the division in October, attaching the full ledger record and the metering data. Meridian's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss in November, arguing that Kansas water law made individual appropriator liability difficult to assign in a multi-user aquifer system. The division rejected that motion in January 1975. Raymond spent that winter in his equipment shed, maintaining his 1954 Farmall Super M, the big red International Harvester tractor, worn at the seat and solid in every working part, that he had bought used at a Finney County farm sale in 1960 and kept on a written schedule ever since. He changed the oil every 150 hours by the hour meter on the dash. He checked the magneto timing each spring, inspected the hydraulic seals at the first sign of seeping, replaced any worn component before it failed rather than after. The maintenance log on the wire hook inside the shed door was current to the day. Every entry was in pencil, dated, initialed RH in February 1975. Lloyd Vance stopped at the north fence line. He was a large man who spoke quietly and had farmed the section north of Raymond's land for 30 years. He stood with one boot on the bottom fence rail, his breath making short white clouds in the cold, still air, and said, "Ray, you're not going to win this one." Raymond said he thought there was a reasonable chance. Lloyd said, "They've got 6 attorneys and a presence in this county. You've got 1 lawyer and a ledger book." Raymond said, "The ledger is what they don't have." Lloyd drove back across his field. That spring, Raymond reduced his irrigated acreage from 220 to 80, running what remained in his upper wells as carefully as he could manage. His fall wheat yield came in at 24 bushels per acre against the 38 he had averaged through the previous decade. He did not miss a payment on the federal land bank note. He sold a set of disc harrows he no longer needed and drew $4,400 from a savings account Dorothy had maintained since 1966. In July 1975, Dr. Philip Crane, a hydrologist from the Kansas Geological Survey, drove out to the property at Harold Veach's arrangement, hired as an expert witness for the case. He was 51 years old, thin, methodical in his speech. He spent the first full morning of his visit at the kitchen table, reading the ledger without speaking, while Dorothy kept the coffee pot warm. The second morning he walked every well with a transit and measuring equipment. On the third morning, sitting across from Raymond at the same table, he said that in 30 years of groundwater investigation in Kansas, he had never examined a private water-level monitoring record of this completeness or duration. Raymond said his father had understood that water was a system with a history, not a supply. Crane submitted his technical report to the division in September 1975. Its central finding was a specific number. Meridian's excess withdrawal had removed approximately 8.4 billion gallons from the Meade County Ogallala Formation, beyond its permitted allocation between March 1972 and August 1975. The damage to adjacent appropriators, including Raymond, was quantifiable and directly attributable. Raymond read the figure at the kitchen table. 8.4 billion gallons. He set the report down. Dorothy refilled his cup without speaking. In November 1975, Meridian's operations manager approached Raymond at the grain elevator and offered a private settlement if Raymond agreed to withdraw his complaint from the division. Raymond said he was not prepared to do that. The manager said the legal process could take years and that a private resolution would be faster for both parties. Raymond said he understood that. The manager drove back to the plant. Dorothy, who had been one aisle over in the elevator store, heard the entire exchange. She came up beside Raymond after the man left. She waited a moment, then said, "You sure?" He said he was. That winter, Raymond wrote to the University of New Mexico's solar energy program and received a technical packet in March 1976. He spread the equipment specifications on the kitchen table and worked through the load calculations for a photovoltaic array matched to a Red Jacket 4-inch submersible pump at 347 feet of depth. He wrote the calculations on the back of a seed corn receipt and kept it in the ledger. The numbers worked at a total system cost of roughly $35,000 to $40,000. He needed the case to deliver that number. He needed 2 more years. He had the patience for both. The division hearing ran 4 days in October 1976 in a government conference room in Topeka. Crane testified for a day and a half. Raymond testified for a single morning, answering questions about his ledger's methodology carefully and without elaboration. When Meridian's lead attorney suggested on cross-examination that a farmer's water level records lacked the scientific rigor of professional hydrological data, Raymond said that Dr. Crane had examined the record thoroughly and found it complete, and that he would defer to the expert on that question. The hearing examiner wrote something on his notepad. He did not look up. The ruling arrived by mail on December 11, 1976. Meridian Beef Products, Inc. had violated its water appropriation permit by a factor of 11, continuously, for more than 4 years. The division ordered Meridian to pay Raymond Holt $43,500 in compensatory damages for documented crop loss and irrigation infrastructure damage. It ordered Meridian to reduce its daily withdrawal to the permitted 185,000 gallons and to install continuous flow metering equipment at its own expense, with quarterly compliance reports submitted to the division. The civil penalty assessed against Meridian was $120,000, payable to the state of Kansas. Raymond read the ruling at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Outside, the light was failing early, the winter plains gone flat and silver gray. He set the papers down. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We got it." Dorothy said, "How much?" He said, $43,500. The state gets $120,000 from them on top of that. She sat down across the table. They both looked at the papers for a while without talking. If this story has kept your attention this long, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. In January 1977, Raymond drove to Topeka to meet with a program officer at the Kansas Energy Office, which had been established the prior year as part of the state's response to the 1973 energy crisis. He brought his ledger, Amos Pruitt's 1938 drill log, and the load calculations he had written on the back of the seed corn receipt. He explained what he intended: a photovoltaic solar array powering a red jacket submersible pump in a 347-foot confined aquifer well, producing irrigation-grade water from a formation the county had never developed, using energy that cost nothing to generate after installation. The program officer said there was no precedent for an installation of that type in Kansas. Raymond said he understood. He wasn't asking for precedent. He was asking for technical coordination. The program officer connected him with the agricultural engineering faculty at Kansas State University, who had been tracking solar pump applications in the Southwest since 1974. By March 1977, Raymond had executed a purchase agreement with a Solarx distributor in Denver. 1840-watt Solarx photovoltaic panels, a charge controller, a 12-volt DC regulation unit, and a red jacket 4-inch submersible pump rated for the load at 347 feet. Equipment cost $31,400. Installation and pump setting labor through a contractor in Liberal, $6,800. Total system, $38,200. The judgment money covered it. $5,300 remained in the account. Construction began in April 1977 in stages, pausing through the winter when the ground froze. Raymond welded the mounting framework himself in the east shed using steel angle iron from a supply house in Dodge City, measuring and cutting from dimensions he had worked out from the New Mexico demonstration photographs. The framework was bolted to a concrete pad he poured in May, set at a slight grade to drain. The panels, each one gray-blue and flat, approximately the size of a standard door, warm and faintly humming under full sun, were mounted south-facing at 35 degrees of tilt, wired in series parallel pairs through weatherproof junction boxes. He ran the wiring underground in conduit to the wellhead. He installed a power output meter on the east shed wall beside the Super M's maintenance log. The system ran its first full test in April 1978. Raymond stood at the wellhead at 6 in the morning, the ground still carrying the night's chill through his boot soles, the air smelling of thawing soil, and the particular mineral sharpness that came off deep well casings. He turned the manual test valve. Water came up from 347 feet and hit the flow meter at 9.1 gallons per minute. During peak generation hours, 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon under clear conditions, the array sustained that flow rate for 6 hours, delivering approximately 3,300 gallons per operating day from the confined aquifer alone. It was not the 20,000-gallon daily capacity he had run before Meridian opened. But it was consistent. It required no fuel. It drew nothing from the rural electric cooperative's overloaded lines, and it reached water that Meridian had never touched and never would. By June 1978, Raymond had written water-sharing operating agreements with Lloyd Vance to the north and 2 grain farms to the south, covering a combined 1,200 acres across 4 properties. Each farm contributed a maintenance fee to a shared account at the Meade County Bank. He filed the cooperative operating agreement with the County Register of Deeds on June 14, 1978. It was the first solar-powered agricultural water cooperative in Meade County, possibly in the state of Kansas. Raymond did not call the newspaper. He did not apply for a designation or submit a report to anyone. That July, Lloyd Vance drove down to the wellhead on a clear morning and stood watching the flow meter turn steadily in the summer sun. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I told you back in February of '75 that you weren't going to win this." Raymond said, "You thought I was fighting the plant. I was building around it." Lloyd looked at the rows of gray-blue panels on the south rise, and at the water moving cleanly through the meter, and at the ditch carrying it north toward his own land. He didn't say anything else. Dr. Philip Crane brought a graduate student named Corinne Albrecht to the Holt property in October 1978. She spent 2 full days measuring output under varied cloud and sun conditions, examining the installation documentation, and recording the deep well's performance history from Raymond's ledger. She was precise in her questions and wrote everything in a spiral-bound field notebook. Her master's thesis, submitted to Kansas State University in the spring of 1980, contained a complete technical description of the Holt installation and 18 months of performance data. It showed the system had delivered an annual average of 3,180 gallons per day across its first operating year, with zero fuel input and a measured panel efficiency degradation of less than 2% from installation specifications. Crane attached the thesis to a formal memo addressed to the director of the Kansas Division of Water Resources in the fall of 1981. The memo identified a specific deficiency. The division's current guidance on confined aquifer systems in High Plains counties had last been revised in 1963 and contained no assessment criteria for deep confined formations and no framework for evaluating solar-powered access infrastructure as part of a water rights application. The division's director, Vernon Castor, replied in writing. His letter read, in part, "The performance record in Ms. Albrecht's thesis and the factual history of the Holt case together demonstrate that the division's 1963 confined aquifer guidance is materially inadequate. We will revise the guidance to incorporate these findings in the upcoming administrative cycle." The revision was published in the Kansas Administrative Register in April 1982. It cited the Holt installation by name, described the 45-year ledger record as the standard against which future private baseline hydrological documentation should be measured, and made mandatory the assessment of confined aquifer potential in all future water rights applications across the High Plains region of Kansas. 2 farms in Grant County, 60 miles north, used that revised guidance the same year to identify confined aquifer systems beneath their own properties and applied for permits to develop solar pump access. Both applications were approved. Both systems were operational by 1984. Neither farm owner had ever met Raymond Holt. One of them, a wheat grower named Dennis Stull, had read a single paragraph about the Holt installation in Kansas Farmer magazine in the fall of 1981. He would say years later that paragraph was the reason he was still farming. Meridian Beef Products, underwent its first mandatory compliance audit under the new quarterly metering requirement in the spring of 1978. The audit recorded their daily withdrawal at 203,000 gallons, slightly above permit, but no longer by a factor of 11. They installed a recirculating water system in 1980 to reduce their gross demand further. The operations manager who had approached Raymond at the elevator in November 1975 was not the same man who managed the facility in 1978. He had resigned the month after the December 1976 ruling. Raymond read the news brief in the Meade County paper and noted it without comment to anyone. If you've come this far with this story, share it with one person. It's the best way to help this channel find more stories like this one. Raymond Holt died in March 1991 at 81 years old. The solar array was still running. The Red Jacket pump had been rebuilt once, in 1986, at a parts cost of $340. Raymond had noted the rebuild in the maintenance log on the wire hook inside the east shed, which by then ran to 4 handwritten pages, dating from Cecil's first entry when the Super M arrived from Meade County in 1954. His daughter Linda drove out from Wichita the week after the funeral and spent 3 days on the property. She had grown up on this land and understood it in the way people understand places that shape them, intuitively, incompletely. She had not known the full depth of what her father had kept until she stood in the east shed and looked at the maintenance log, the water level ledger, and the cooperative operating agreement, all maintained in the same unhurried pencil hand. She walked out to the solar array on a cold gray March morning. The panels still faced south at their 35-degree tilt, their gray-blue surfaces collecting what thin light the overcast allowed. The welded framework Raymond had fabricated 14 years earlier showed surface rust at the joints but had not moved or loosened. She set one hand flat on a panel and felt the faint warmth it held even under those conditions. She called Dr. Crane at Kansas State, who was near retirement. He told her the Holt installation was the longest continuously operating rural solar pump system in the state of Kansas. He told her its performance data had been cited in 16 separate published papers on agricultural and hydrological engineering. Linda walked the property that afternoon with the ledger under her arm. She read entries her grandfather had made in 1934, when the dust had been running for 2 years and the upper wells were dropping faster than usual. She read her father's entries from the spring of 1978, when the solar pump first ran at full load, and he had measured the flow at 9.1 gallons per minute and written it down in the same column, in the same hand, as everything before it. At the deep well, she lowered the old measuring line, the same braided cotton cord and steel float her grandfather had made in 1929, and counted off the feet as it descended. The float found the water surface, and the line went slack. 278 feet. In 53 years of careful measurement, the confined aquifer had dropped 3 feet. 3 feet in 53 years, while the Ogallala above it had lost more than 40 feet across most of southwest Kansas. She understood, standing at that wellhead in the March cold with the measuring line coiled in her hands, that she was looking at water her grandfather had never drawn on, her father had used with precision, and that she would need to think of with the same care. She continued the cooperative operating agreement the following spring, renewing the arrangement with the neighboring farms her father had written in 1978. She had 2 panels replaced and the underground wiring inspected. She continued the ledger, her own pencil entries in the column beside her father's, using the same float and the same cotton line. A young man from the KSU Agricultural Engineering Department came out in the summer of 1993 to document the system for a departmental case study. He spent an afternoon examining the array and the pump installation, and at the end of the day said that the system was running at near original efficiency, which he had not expected. Linda said he maintained it. The young man said, "Most systems this age aren't worth maintaining." Linda said, "He didn't think of it that way. He thought maintenance was the reason something stayed true." The 1954 Farmall Super M still stood in the east shed, red, with white lettering worn pale at the hood edges. The seat cracked on the right side where Raymond had always sat slightly forward, leaning into the work. Cecil had started the maintenance log when the tractor arrived used from a Meade County auction in 1954. Raymond had continued it for 37 years. Linda maintained it now. In May 1994, she walked her son Thomas through the property on a morning when the winter wheat was just beginning to head out, the plains sky enormous and pale above them, the smell of new grain coming warm from the south on a light wind. Thomas was 11. He stopped at the south rise and asked why the solar panels were still running when the Rural Electric Cooperative had extended its line through the district in 1988 and the whole area had grid service now. Linda said, "Because we don't know what electricity will cost in 20 years, and because they still work." Thomas stood looking at the panels for a moment. At the deep well, she showed him how to lower the measuring line. He let it down slowly, hand over hand, counting off the feet the way she had shown him, and felt the moment when the float reached the water surface and the resistance changed, the slight give in the line, the way the tension shifted. He said, 276. Linda wrote it in the ledger. The well Cecil Holt had drilled in 1938 into a confined formation his neighbors hadn't known existed, which Raymond had sustained through a 2-year legal fight, and then a water crisis that broke a dozen surrounding farms, which had been lifting clean water from sunlight alone since 1978, still produced water on May mornings in 1994. Cold, the way it had always been cold. Tasting of iron and limestone, the way water tastes when it has been sitting undisturbed in darkness for a very long time. The ledger ran to 840 entries. There is a specific kind of knowledge that accumulates across generations through nothing more than the habit of measuring things exactly and writing the numbers down. From a distance, it does not resemble expertise. It resembles stubbornness, or an excess of caution, or a refusal to accept what everyone around you is willing to accept. But when the institution says drought and the record says otherwise, and the record is 45 years of numbers in 2 careful hands in the same book, the institution is wrong and the record is right. The record is always right. Raymond Holt did not build a solar water system to make a point to anyone. He built it because the water was there and the technology arrived at the precise moment he could afford it, And because everything he needed, the knowledge of the deep aquifer, the legal evidence, the funding, the patience, had been assembling below the surface, season by season, for decades before he needed any of it. The water still came up cold. If this story reached you, subscribe and share this channel. The work of finding and telling stories this carefully documented depends entirely on you.